Yu-Gi-Oh! Power creep might just be worse than you initially thought. Cards today are just better than cards 5 years ago, that much is obvious. But in what way? And can we find a clear way to explain this? The game, as we all know and love, as prophesized, is dead. No, we're not doing that. And look, if you did click on this video hoping that this would just be bashing the game, that's not exactly what this is going to be. Everyone obviously hates their own game a little bit, so, some of that. But that's not what this is about. Power creep has become a buzzword in modern gaming to refer to just about anything involving the forward flow of time. But what do we actually mean? Champions and heroes released in 2026 are usually just flat out better than those 8 years ago, with better ults, more flexible signature abilities, and generous activation requirements. Hell, they've even managed to power creep chess. Angeliki, an archetype which can take your opponent's monsters through the EMZ in Genesis format. Genesis format. Yeah, listen, the problem with Genesis format is, in the context and realm of power creep, join me as we together define, discuss, and dissect this topic in complete depth. First of all, we will begin with outlining power creep. What does it mean? What does that actually constitute? Second of all, we will quickly highlight some of the most egregious examples of power creep and what that actually entails. Of course, some of this will be quite obvious. How far can we go from a Fallen of the White Dragon versus a Mathmech Circular only a few years ago? And third of all, today we will be going over the quiet power creep, the sort of spark for what caused me to think about this and discuss this topic. What does that mean? What is the quiet power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! And what are some of those examples? And finally, we will be talking about the future and what this means in the long term. This sounds like your kind of video, then please make sure to subscribe, like the video, leave a comment down below with some of your examples and features of what power creep and the quiet power creep could entail. I'm waiting for you to subscribe. No, we're not doing this. Look, it's rough out here, dude. Power creep is the slow and gradual escalation of power within game design, where champions, loadouts, talents, cards, and decks are fundamentally more powerful than their previous versions and iterations in almost any and all circumstances. Why does this happen? Well, power creep usually is used as a tool to sell future updates, future boxes, and cards for you to purchase because you're gonna wanna just play with the broken shit. That makes sense, right? From a business perspective anyway, it makes sense. In 2016, Konami printed the card Twin Twisters, a quick play spell that, for the cost of a discard, could destroy 2 of your opponent's spells and traps. Twin Twisters became the go-to back row removal because, while Twin Twisters had a discard cost, more often than not, this could be seen as a positive, with graveyard effects becoming more prominent at the time, and notwithstanding the loss of a card in hand, with 2 to 3 card combos being the norm, it was often better to just clear the powerful back row like Solemn Strike and Fogblade to guarantee your plays at the time. Twin Twisters quite literally replaced the Mystical Space Typhoon overnight. In the 7 or so years since then, MST has been ran over Twin Twisters in only really a handful of deck lists until, of course, the modern advent of things like Lightning Storm, and even the archetype based around MST, Radiant Typhoon. And yet, where is Twin Twisters today? In the same way that MST was replaced, Twin Twisters likewise got replaced with the Lightning Storm, and even an unbelievable, still banned card in the TCG, Red Reboot. In the context of back row removal, spell and trap destruction, this linear and gradual change for the power level that we've seen over the last 10 years is really well encapsulated in the process going from MST to Twin Twisters to Lightning Storm and Red Reboot, and even circling back in some ways today with the unbanning in recent years of Harpy's Feather Duster. But for the most part, you can see that there is this cascading level of power with regards to just individual cards. Over time, we've seen all sorts of Yu-Gi-Oh cards get stronger in different categories, from the defensive cards to the extenders, the extra deck toolbox. Things have only gotten more resilient, versatile, and the ceilings of the combos have also increased to staggering heights over the course of the game's lifespan. Now, my favorite cards to talk about in this context is the extra deck toolbox monsters, and I think they perfectly elucidate exactly what we're talking about today. One of the first Xyz monsters ever printed was Maestroke, the Symphony Djinn, a generic rank 4 that could be used to very simply set a monster your opponent controls from face up attack position to face down. This was one of the first generic Xyz monsters that could deal with your opponent's problem monsters. Remove is a strong word to use for Maestroke, but the idea of setting a monster and then attacking over it was sort of the goal that you were going with. Defense points were usually smaller than attack points. Now, first and foremost, the thing to highlight here is that Maestroke is an extra deck monster. There is no requirement to draw Maestroke. In the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh, more often than not, you would have to wait until you could actually draw an out to problem monsters. Fissure, a Metamorphosis with a level 1 to equip your opponents, or just simply drawing the one of Dark Hole in a deck that consisted of at least 40 cards. And so with removing cards at any point in time, if you had 2 level 4s, no requirements of a tuner, no requirements of an archetype, you could overlay 2 guys into Maestroke and attack over something. And while Maestroke is a good card to be able to get over monsters, there is a lot of prerequisites. Your opponent must have no response from the hand, they must have no back row, they must have no back row that deal with summoning or attacking, and on top of that, the monster must have no protection of sorts. Well, the next step after Maestroke, less than a year later, was Black Ship of Khorne, another rank 4 monster whose effect read that you could simply target a face-up monster your opponent controls and send it to the graveyard, while even performing a bonus 1000 burn damage. No battle phase required this time. But notice how the gap is very minimal. The Black Ship of Khorne isn't so much better than Maestroke. It wasn't leagues ahead, and in 2013, when this card was released, if you were playing a rank 4 deck, you would more often than not just play both of them together. Sometimes it'd be good to do the little bit of burn damage, sometimes sending was better, sometimes the monster would have too much attack points, but very little defense points, and so Maestroke would be the better option. The following year, in 2014, we saw 2 cards released in the same set, Legacy of the Valiant, Evil Swarm Exciton Knight, and Silent Honor Arc. And these cards alone propelled the rank 4 pool to new heights like never before. Rank 4s were already the most generic ways to interact with the extra deck by this point, and since they didn't require a tuner, and the most economical normal summon in Yu-Gi-Oh is the level 4, which maximizes the stat weights given to a card without requiring a tribute, this was good for pretty much every relevant archetype at the time. Evil Swarm Exciton Knight was a quick effect, again, quick effect, to destroy all other cards on the field once per chain, as long as you had less total cards than your opponent. I don't think I need to explain how this eclipses both Maestroke and Black Ship in most contexts, and I understand that this is comparing apples to oranges somewhat, since the removal in this context is based on things like card advantage, or even your own potential set cards risking being blown up. Years later, in the set Flames of Destruction, we got the Nightmares, a series of Link monsters that were completely generic, and that they had no level requirements to make in the first place, but with the cost of discarding, a potential positive effect for many decks around this time period, like the Orcusts, they could destroy all kinds of cards. Cerberus could destroy a special summon monster, Phoenix could hit a spell and trap, and Unicorn could avoid the graveyard altogether by returning its target to the deck, albeit by requiring one more Link material. But the reason these cards were so good was that if your deck could facilitate the swarming and the bodies, you could summon these over each other, unlike an Xyz monster. Plenty of danger decks and other swarm strategies around at the time could just keep flooding the field with monsters, and so you'd make a Nightmare into a Cerberus, into a Unicorn, and through that you have eliminated 3 of your opponent's cards, just because of how generic the summoning mechanic itself of Link monsters is. If you want to find out a little bit more about this time period specifically and are interested in watching a documentary on this, I have a video on my channel called The Story of Firewall Dragon, which you can check out and have a look at and see exactly how this time period unfolded. Yet curiously, despite how generic and useful the Nightmares are, they've almost vanished from competitive play. I don't think I've seen a Nightmare in an extra deck of a topping deck list in years at this point. At least not for their intended purpose. Because enter SP Little Knight, a completely generic Link 2 that can banish any card on the field or in the graveyard, while in the process having a trigger effect to dodge targeting abilities that your opponent might use to disrupt her. From Maestroke to Little Knight, the chasm in power and the game design gap we talked about earlier is obvious. And that's not to criticize this or say that this is a bad thing, but it is very interesting to see that gradual change from the extra deck monster toolbox into the position that it is in today. So what do we mean by slow power creep? We've given a linear example of how this has been really obvious with things like the toolbox and the extra deck. And of course, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the obvious power creep in terms of the powerful archetypes. That much is pretty obvious. But I wanted to talk about the more niche effects on cards and how these are so plentiful nowadays that sometimes we don't even necessarily think about them. And so it's a bit odd that I'm going to be bringing up Snake Eyes Poplar since I did mention niche effects, but it is very fascinating because there is a certain aspect here that I think is extrapolated upon other cards and become the norm. What do I mean by that? Understanding why Snake Eye was so good on the surface is obvious. This card was part of a singular card combo, of which there were more than 20 starters that facilitated it, which gave you a nigh-on unbreakable board that could pretty much beat most Yu-Gi-Oh decks ever made. I wanted to bring up Poplar because this is perhaps the ultimate version of power creep in a singular card. There are parts of this card which have been copied time and time again onto other cards to make modern archetypes stronger, and it's this part here. If added from deck to hand, Poplar becomes a special summon. A typical normal summon that gets you a body out of the deck, like for example, Tour Guide from the Underworld. Hey. These become very vulnerable to hand traps. So while Snake Eye Ash, its main facilitator, could be negated and disrupted, when Poplar is added from the deck to the hand with Bonfire, a normal spell that simply reads add a Pyro, this buffs Bonfire from a regular searcher to an emergency teleport, a free body from the deck. This exact effect has been duplicated onto other cards, like Tenpai Genroku, a support card of Tenpai that essentially allowed you to do the same thing. Turn a searcher in the deck from a normal run-of-the-mill Rota into a special summon directly out of the deck for any named monster you require. Junk Armor does the same thing for Synchron support, Crowley, the Magistus Fusion, and even lower powered decks in Genesis format like Emmy Blitzkrieg have had this exact wording duplicated onto their effects to power up modern cards. Cards that you wouldn't normally think of as extremely broken or powerful have taken this template and have moved forward with this power creep. Let's talk about another example, and that is reinforcements of the army. Rota, the standard for searching cards. I've mentioned it once or twice already in this video. Archetypes and different decks have had different Rotas be given extra tacked on effects that give them extra power creep. Theorealize is one of the most blatant examples of this. It's a foolish burial with 3 separate extra effects for no real reason. Theorealize can send Medius from deck to grave for cost. Without interacting with any hand traps or stops from your opponent, this card instantly puts Medius into rotation irrespective of what your opponent may want to respond with. The second effect, although we're still technically on the first effect, but the thing is, the cost, you could look at that as just a good effect in and of itself. The second effect is that this card stacks your opponent's top deck. So going first, you get to take a peek at the opponent's top deck. Is it a good starter card that you would rather not deal with? You can send it to the bottom. Is it a hand trap that they're top decking? Well, that's very likely going to be dead on turn 2. You can leave it on top. Having that knowledge of what your opponent has in their hand is invaluable in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And how you will be using your disruptions. The third effect of Theorealize is that you can banish it from your grave and manipulate the type and attribute of any monster you control. If you want to incorporate a small Fiendsmith engine in your deck, well, now if your opponent stops your normal summon or any monster on your side of the field, you can just turn it into a light fiend with the grave effect of Theorealize and go into Requiem for full combo. This has been a common theme for modern archetypes. Even rogue ones. It's tacking on bonus effects onto Rotas, onto Foolish Burials, onto these basic searchers and standard combo lines of spell cards. There are graveyard effects attached onto traps as well to help give you some more resources and resilience. Another example I want to go over is recycling hand traps. This has become a modern kind of theme for a lot of archetypes. I remember the first major example of this consistent interaction was in 2019, where Sunlight Wolf could add back Ash Blossom from the graveyard. But now we've had decks like Cooltoon, and notably Dracotail as an archetype, take advantage of this. Blue Eyes, a deck that could just search Effect Veiler, was very much a relevant part of the early discourse of this year. Going back to Arthalion, it is a boss monster which would normally be designed in a way so as to act as removal. But instead of removing cards, it can also recycle resources in your graveyard and let you reuse your disruption. And I think this is emblematic of a lot of modern card design. While the most obvious thing to say is, well, more text means more effects, which means more power, it's important to question what type of effects are being added on. Because you see, a card like Arthalion might not be the most powerful boss monster, in the same way like a Red Eyes Dark Dragoon is, but it is far more versatile. And I think that's what matters when it comes to having a powerful boss monster, outside of just the obvious quick effect negate. Having a boss monster that can deal with multiple situations and going first, second, offensively, defensively, and even having the ability to bring itself back. There are plenty of examples in the last 2 or 3 years of extra little small effects here and there that have made modern archetypes and decks and boss monsters be extremely powerful. If there's any that you think are particularly egregious, or things that go under the radar that you've noticed as a pattern, a template that Konami keeps reusing on multiple different cards, then leave a comment down below and I'll be sure to read through. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'm telling you again, please subscribe. Yes, like the video, and of course follow me where I do daily streams on twitch.tv/Farfa. I'll see you in the next one. Adios.